And in 2010, China expressed in a joint task force statement about their fishing fleet the following sentence: occupying brings about rights and interests. Occupying brings about rights and interests. And so their distant water fishing fleet has become an arm of the claims that they are making about sort of territorial rights regarding marine spaces that have no basis in international law. So I think what China is doing is two things simultaneously. They're ensuring that when anyone, anywhere in the world, in any language, goes on to ChatGPT or any AI platform and asks a question about what the law is about something, they have the answer. They have controlled the answer. That's one point. And the other is that when a new issue arises, they actually can point to all the literature to say, here are all the experts that have ever opined on it. This is what they say. This is in our favor. And so China has the world's largest fishing fleet by a long, long way. And the problem is that some might say, well, they're just bigger, they're just doing more. That's not the case. They are using it in ways that no one else is.
Welcome back, everyone. In today's video, we're diving deep into the complex world of China's fishing fleet and its global implications. We explain the distinction between Chinese slavery and human trafficking and explore how other countries can respond. Discover how China is weaponizing fish against the U.S. and the historical rights claimed by their expansive fishing fleet. We give credit to the Philippines for their resilient fight. We also explore China's new front in making up sources of international law. Stay tuned for the revelation of China finding shipwrecks worldwide to secure their territorial claims. It's a packed episode, so let's dive in.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today we have a great guest. It's Ian Ralby, who is an Maritime and International Affairs expert. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Could you please tell us a little bit what you do and who you are?
Absolutely. My name is Ian Ralby. I am a maritime lawyer by background, but for the last 15 or so years, my focus has been at the intersection of law and security, and particularly looking at maritime security threats around the world. I often glibly say that I fight pirates, traffickers, smugglers, and thieves. But increasingly over the last few years, my work has ventured beyond the criminal space and the security and safety spaces into the realm of defense and looking at the activities of some of the key hybrid aggressors in the maritime domain, primarily China, Russia, and Iran. And I look at all the nefarious conduct that's occurring on the water and how we can work together as a community to make sure that the oceans are safe, secure, stable, and prosperous.
Great, thank you so much. I found an article really interesting you wrote recently about, and you made a distinction there between human trafficking versus slavery, and you mentioned that the Chinese vessels and the ships which own the fishermen's lives, you said they actually there is a connection between those vessels, the crews, and the government, the state. And that's a very interesting distinction. Could you please tell us a little bit more about it and what consequences this might have for China?
Absolutely. One of the reasons I went into maritime law in the first place is that it is weird. It is different. Once you step off of the land, the maritime domain is unusual to most who spend all their time focused on the land. And one of the things that is difficult about the maritime space is understanding both the different jurisdictions and the enforcement jurisdiction within those. In other words, we have different zones of maritime activity, and we have different abilities to counter illicit or undesirable activity in each of those zones. And there's a major distinction between human trafficking, which is a domestically focused offense under international law, and slavery. There are, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, only 3 crimes that hold a universal approach to being able to board a vessel outside of the domestic jurisdiction of a state. They are slavery, piracy, and illegal broadcasting. Illegal broadcasting, almost nobody talks about it anymore, although it may come up again with some of the new technology providers being able to broadcast internet into a jurisdiction. But pirate radio is somewhat out of the discussion. But slavery and piracy are both very important to recognize as encapsulated in international law in the maritime space, where yes, you can board your own vessel anywhere. So if you are 13 miles off the coast of another country and your flagged vessel is there doing something, well, it's doing anything, you as the Navy or Coast Guard of your state can board it. But if you're 13 miles off the coast of another country, you can't just board for any other offense, with the exception of piracy, slavery, and unauthorized broadcasting. And so slavery has this particularly important role in maritime law. But there's a difference between what slavery means and what human trafficking means because of this notion of ownership. Human trafficking looks very similar. Often it is people who are being coerced or forced into some kind of activity, be it forced labor, debt bondage, illegal begging, forced begging, forced marriages, all these sorts of things, sexual exploitation. And all of those can look like slavery, but the difference between the two is ownership. And once you exert ownership over the life of another human being, it ventures into slavery. Now, that distinction is very poorly clarified in most of our discourse around this issue. And it's very poorly defined in most states' domestic laws. And so when it comes to making that kind of an operational distinction at sea, where you get on board a vessel for whatever reason and see somebody in shackles, is it human trafficking? Is it slavery? What can you do about it? And the problem we have right now is that very few jurisdictions on Earth have provided their navies, coast guards, and marine police forces the legal ability to actually interdict slavery. Even though they can board a vessel to look for slavery, they can't actually arrest anyone for it. They can't bring that case back into their national courts and prosecute someone for it. Now, this may sound like a bizarre oversight. How could this possibly be? But if we backtrack about 15 years, when we started dealing with piracy off the coast of Somalia, this was the same sort of issue. So we had lots of piracy incidents occurring, and all the Navy said, well, we've got universal jurisdiction for stopping piracy under UNCLOS, under Article 110. Yes, that's true. So they'd go out, they'd stop the cases, they'd scoop up the pirates, and then they had no wherewithal to actually go and take them into a court and change the risk-reward calculus for the pirates. Because if all they'd ended up doing was then releasing them and sending them back, well, then they were just going to come do it again. If the worst thing that could happen is that you just got stopped in the middle of the act, well, just keep at it. Odds are you'll be successful one of these days. And so the same is now true of slavery. And what has just occurred is that we've had a number of reports over the years, and a recent expose that lasted 4 years in the New Yorker by Ian Urbina and his team at the Outlaw Ocean Project really helped reveal just the systematic extent of what looked like human trafficking in individual instances. But if you add it up over the whole, really looks like the Chinese fleet, which is largely government owned or beneficially owned in some ways by government interests, can exert enough control over the individuals that they effectively own their lives, that they can say whether or not they get medical treatment, they can say whether or not they live or die. And that ownership notion means that we need to be much more prepared to be able to identify and then actually do something about slavery when we encounter it at sea. And this is the big issue that's at stake.
Okay, but could we be more detailed? Let's say, because I don't think anyone except the US would board such a vessel. Let's say the US boards a Chinese fishing ship or even few in a fleet. What can they do then? They detain everyone, and then maybe they can translate, take statements in Chinese, and then what can they do later? They prosecute them, they charge, they sue the Chinese government. They bring those people to the US. What can they do?
Well, I want to highlight that this issue doesn't just exist for the U.S. in the Western Pacific, for example. This is an issue that I think whether you are a coastal state looking at boarding outside of 12 nautical miles for your own fisheries enforcement, it's something you need to be concerned about. So let's take Ghana. I know very well. So let's say Ghana Navy goes out to interdict a fishing vessel at 30 miles off the coast for suspected IUU fishing, and it happens to be Chinese flagged or beneficially owned by China. And on board, they find Uyghurs or Indonesians or some third country national literally in shackles. Unless Ghanaian law has given their navy the express extraterritorial jurisdiction to interdict slavery and prosecute it in Ghana, that case ends up being almost impossible to deal with because human trafficking can only be interdicted within the territorial sea, which is out to 12 nautical miles. You can sometimes deal with it at out to 24 nautical miles for vessels that are coming in under what is called the contiguous zone, which allows you to interdict vessels for financial immigration, sanitation, or customs violations. And so under immigration law, you could stop it. But at 30 miles, if you're looking at a potential slavery case, you may have an issue of jurisdiction and not be able to actually do anything about it. And so your question about the U.S. is relevant. So let me dive into that. What could the U.S. do? Well, obviously, there are a couple of options for how you act. There is always the possibility of finding some other offense. If there's another offense, it may make it easier. So let's say there's a boarding under the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, WCPFC, and it's on the high seas, and there's a potential fisheries violation and a potential concern about slavery. The fisheries violation is the easy one to deal with there because there is the ability to go after it. The slavery one is where we really don't have enough clarity in terms of our law. Now, what we have done in the past in the U.S. Is for certain offenses use the Suppression of Unlawful Acts at Sea Convention, SUA, and have been able to get to a conviction on that. But it's very, very difficult because of the jurisdictional lines. And so practically, the boarding officers will have to make a choice as to what they request to do. And right now, we're not giving them enough support. So I don't want to guess what the boarding officers would do, but we need to come up with some very clear and mutually agreed among lots of different states position on how we would handle this issue so that we aren't leaving the boarding officers in the incredibly difficult, both personal and emotional situation of having to decide what they can and can't do to stop what looks like a case of human slavery.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
If I understand you correctly, then in your research, you already found such cases. You faced them, right? So was there anything done in those cases? Like how did they continue? Was there any follow-up?
So there have not been many cases under the slave trade. This is not something that does come up very often. We've seen cases, but I'm not aware of any prosecutions that have been successful in any domestic court. And this is the problem. It's a bit like piracy discussions back in 2008, 2009. We were saying at the time, yeah, there have been piracy cases, but nobody was prosecuting for piracy because it wasn't seen as a big enough issue. And so they'd find some other violation, some other offense to stop that particular case and potentially, free whoever it was involved. But there wasn't an actual follow-through prosecution. So just like with the pirates, we are now seeing situations where navies and coast guards will find other ways, other mechanisms, potentially get people who are clearly experiencing some sort of profound human rights violation to get freed. And of course, there's always the option for going to the flag state. And so this is the challenge. So you would have to get the right now, legally, the way it would work is if the U.S. did that boarding under WCPFC, they would have to get flag state consent. And if the flag state is China and China sees no problem with the people on board being in shackles, then there's very little practically that can be done from a legal standpoint. So we need to arm our navies and coast guards with better tools to be able to confront the scourge of slavery today.
Okay, but you mentioned, I think you mentioned as an example, Indonesians, I would guess probably Filipinos. So what about their governments? Let's say their citizens are being found in shackles, like can they proceed against China?
I mean, they can use a potential state-on-state claim under the passive personality jurisdiction, but it is a very weak option. I mean, they would have to literally they wouldn't be able to do anything to directly help their citizens straight away. That's, I think, the problem is that, yeah, sure, they could potentially bring a case in the International Court of Justice for violation of the 1926 Slavery Convention. 10 years later, the people that were enslaved aren't going to care whether that goes forward or not if they're already dead or if they've been in slavery for the last 10 years. And so this is where the academic side of this, the sort of slow-moving legislative side of this, and the practical operational side of this clash, because what we need is operational guidance today, not a long-term process that in 20 years will lead to a clear convention. We need something now.
Good. So that's very extensive. Thank you so much. And I want to ask you about something else. I saw you discussed recently on LinkedIn an article about the distant water fishing fleet, and there was a title that said China weaponizing fish against the US. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? It seems connected to what we just discussed.
Yeah. So I think it's easy to pick on China with the slavery issue because they are the biggest player and the most extensive. And it's easy as well because they're doing so many other nefarious things with their distant water fleet. And I think that's where the scrutiny has come. So China has the world's largest fishing fleet by a long, long way. And the problem is that some might say, well, they're just bigger, they're just doing more. That's not the case. They are using it in ways that no one else is, and this is where there's a real problem. First, of course, we have concerns about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing occurring in other countries' exclusive economic zones. So going into another country's 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone and literally stealing, or in some ways illegally being involved with the harnessing of their sovereign living marine resources. That's a problem. That's kind of within the realm of what we would expect. The issue is that China's doing other things too. And in 2010, China expressed in a joint task force statement about their fishing fleet the following sentence: occupying brings about rights and interests. Occupying brings about rights and interests. And so their distant water fishing fleet has become an arm of the claims that they are making about sort of territorial rights regarding marine spaces that have no basis in international law. So for years, they have been claiming this 9-line territory of the South China Sea that is way outside the realm and space of what UNCLOS would give to China based on its geographic presence in different island and coastal features. They have made that claim on the grounds of traditional fishing rights. They are essentially saying that historically they have fished in the South China Sea and therefore they own it. And so in the same way, their distant water fishing fleet is being used to essentially advance the notion that by being present in other places, be it on the high seas or even in the exclusive economic zone of another state, they can essentially claim some degree of right of ownership. And that is anathema. It is completely contrary to international law and to the notion that the high seas are the common heritage of all mankind. It is also contrary to the High Seas Treaty that was just established earlier this year. And so they are, in some ways, using their fleet to fight against international law, but they're doing it in a way that is really building a case. And so one of the things that they are using is sort of these nefarious tactics of essentially fishing, processing fish, and then selling that fish to key players in order to almost bolster the credibility of their claim. And so in the early 19th century, China experienced two horrifically embarrassing defeats that led to them calling it the century of shame. And they were called the Opium Wars because the main tactic was Britain using low-cost Indian opium to essentially create both a wider scale addiction and a balance in trade, because Britain was buying lots of things from China, silk and China and gold, all kinds of goods, spices, but China didn't want any British goods. And so Britain balanced the trade accounts with opium, and then used the funds from that balanced account to build up its forces, and then actually ended up fighting China twice over and defeating them quite soundly. And China remembers this. Xi Jinping has actually mentioned the embarrassment of the Opium Wars and sort of getting over that embarrassment in some of his recent statements. And essentially what they have looked at is China has a very interesting understanding of warfare at this point. In 1999, they published a document called Unrestricted Warfare. Two senior Air Force colonels in the PLA published this document. And in it, they analyzed the United States and the West as having a fundamental flaw in our thinking about military advancement. Our problem, according to them, is that we see military advancement as being through technology only. We don't recognize other forms of warfare, in particular economic and legal. But they then went forward and highlighted 11 different forms of non-kinetic warfare that were at China's disposal, at anybody's disposal, but particularly at China's disposal, in order to engage in warfare without actually fighting. And so they include things like resources warfare, plundering other countries' resources, development aid warfare, using the leverage from development, smuggling warfare, drug warfare, all these different things they mentioned specifically, and there are 11 different ones. And what they then did was, that was 1999, and in 2003, they indoctrinated that formally into what they call the three warfares doctrine, where they looked at public opinion warfare, economic warfare, and legal warfare as being pillars of the ability to fight without fighting. So they are looking to, their express strategy is to win without fighting. And so the fleet is an arm of this. The fleet is being used to fight the West, fight the rest of the world. And one of the key tools is the use of fish that is in some ways illegally caught or caught in an area where they are trying to occupy and thus gain rights and interests, and then process it, sometimes using Uyghur slaves, and then sell it to the very countries that would counter their argument. And so it undermines the ability, in a similar fashion to how the sale of drugs undermined the ability of China to resist. And at the same time, in parallel to this fish focus, obviously fentanyl and other narcotics have become and psychotropic substances have become a critical piece. And we just had a discussion between President Xi and President Biden about fentanyl, but we aren't talking as much about fish. And this is where we're missing out on what is happening in this non-kinetic warfare.
So in a way, stealing IP or stealing fish is just payback time.
Exactly.
And we deserve it, yes. Okay.
That is very much, I think, the Chinese position. And you can see where they got the claim. And the thing is, the Chinese memory is long, but it is also selective. Because there is a lot of picking and choosing how to form the narrative, because the Cultural Revolution, for example, has been completely forgotten. They have been as successful in erasing the memory of the Cultural Revolution as the Cultural Revolution was in erasing the memory of the rest of Chinese history. So it's an interesting dynamic. They're very good at both drawing on history and erasing it.
Liking and subscribing is greatly appreciated, and it helps me keep this channel going. My goal is to spread the opinions and experience of the best people in this industry.
Good. Now, what can, for example, China's neighbors like the Philippines do with the aggression they've been facing in the recent months? What can they do with that? Like we talked about fish, what now about more military violence?
Well, often the two are closely linked, because both fishing and fishing vessels are being used for this aggression in some ways, and is a complement to the military. But I think I have to credit the Philippines for being just an incredibly bold, brave, and stalwart defender of democracy and defender of international law at this point. They are doing an amazing job. And the way they're doing it is through two things. On the one hand, not allowing China's claims, spurious claims, as well as physical attempts to back up those claims, to dissuade them from what their rights are and what the law is. And they are engaged in what's expressly called a transparency campaign or transparency initiative. Since February of this year, it has been incredibly helpful to follow the Twitter account of Commodore Jay Terriella, who's the Philippines Coast Guard architect of this transparency initiative. I encourage everyone to follow his account, because he is the one responsible for essentially sharing the videos of what's happening, the actual day-to-day pictures of the evidence of what China is doing to aggress against Philippines in contravention of express law and legal opinions. This is not something that is, our interpretation of the law. No, this was the Permanent Court of International Arbitration's interpretation of the law, saying that China had no basis of claiming, for example, Second Thomas Shoal. And yet every couple of days, the Chinese and the Filipinos are in close to combat situations regarding resupply to the Sierra Madre, the vessel that is kept by the Filipinos on Second Thomas Shoal. And this is a scary situation because the Filipinos are doing an amazing job, but they are really at the coalface. They are at the forefront of this. The U.S. is trying to back them, but we need others to come together, because the only way to take down a bully is if everybody else stands up to them. And right now they're trying to bully their way into legal interpretations that are very contrary to what the rest of us have already agreed on. They're looking to bully their way into claims that have no basis either in history or in law. They're looking at bullying their way into ownership of sovereign states and ownership of human beings, as we were discussing before. And we have to push back, because no matter what your interpretation is, none of that can be okay. And so the I think responsibility of the rest of the world is to come together and to stand on the principles that we've all agreed, stand on the law that we've created as tools to push back on this, and take a leaf out of the Filipino playbook. The more we expose what is going on and be open and honest about it and discuss it in a way that allows for us to really say, hang on a minute, this conduct is not okay. The basis of this is not okay. That's where we can actually begin to push back. And a lot of these ridiculous claims are given far too much credibility. And so what we need to do is be able to laugh at them and say, this is absurd. No, sorry, nice try. But instead, we're giving them a little bit too much, time to make the claim, assert the claim, and then for us to come and say maybe a year later, actually, no, you can't build these artificial islands. Well, too late. They're not only built, they're militarized, and the claims of rights around them are already being exerted and backed up. So we've lost. And so we need to push back more quickly. And the only way to do that is through community and common mutual approaches.
It seems like China's neighbors slowly band together, like its neighbors like the Philippines, Japan, Vietnam, India, Indonesia start cooperating. So it looks a bit better. I mean, it looks like time now works in neighbors' favor.
Yes, to a certain degree. Not everybody, and part of it is the political will of any day. But there are also strategic shocks that can really upend this. For example, if you look at the strategic shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was felt around the world. I was in Fiji at the end of March of 2022. So a month and a half, just over a month after the invasion. I get into a cab and the first comment is, man, we are really feeling this war in Ukraine. That is about as far on the earth as you can get from the Black Sea, and yet it was being felt there. And the way that has played out for some of the neighbors is a challenge, because China was effectively the guarantor for Russia to go into Ukraine. By signing a trade deal on the 4th of February 2022 in the margins of the Beijing Olympics, Russia was aware at that point that no matter how many sanctions the West would impose on them, they still had the largest purchaser of oil and gas and of grain available to them as a market. And so when Russia started experiencing all these sanctions, yes, it was tough on some of the oligarchs who lost their yachts, and there were all kinds of frustrations around that. But notice their economy has not completely collapsed. It is not done. It has not crippled them to the point that they can no longer.
And now they seem to recover, and they seem to be doing better and better.
Exactly. And China has been the anchor of that sort of third global economy. We've always had the legal and the illicit, and we now have the sanctioned. And China is trying to be the primary hegemon in all three. And so China's control of the sanctioned economy means that a lot of states that have fragile situations, be it because of a population and debt, or because of food security crises, or whatever it is, or energy concerns, they have to hedge. And so what we've seen is, despite the need to push back against this bully, there's also a need among some of the states to try to make sure that they're as non-aligned as possible, so that if one horse wins, they're not a loser. And so we've seen some of the states having to, in order to make sure that they have enough grain supply to feed a massive population, cozying up to Beijing, even though Beijing has been hostile to their interests. And so it is a difficult position for a lot of states. And I think we can stand on principles, but at the end of the day, people need to be fed. And there's an existential issue for some of these states. And that's just for the big ones. If you then look at some of the smaller states, particularly in the Pacific Islands, and even farther afield in Africa and in Latin America and elsewhere, states are really struggling. And so China is providing the only offer on the table. And so if we talk about competition, but principles don't compete with food. If you're going to eat, if you're hungry, you need to eat. You're not caring whether that food was sustainably sourced. That's the issue. And so our playing field of competition and their playing field of competition are very different. And as far as they're concerned, they're not competing, they're at war. It's just not kinetic war.
Ian, my last question is, what have you been recently researching? And what should we be looking for in 2024? What's your interest?
I think there are a couple of things that I think are worth looking at. One of them is China's increasing, two things about China's increased activity, one on publications and one on underwater archaeology. There are officially 4 sources of international law. There's treaties and conventions, customary international law, the law of sovereign states, and then both the judicial opinions of courts, as well as the publications and speeches of recognized experts. And this last one, this source of international law, is where China is focusing. And they're flooding the world with new literature about legal positions and opinions on issues that maybe haven't ever been discussed before. So, for example, if you look at underwater archaeology as something that China has taken an interest in, they're flooding the literature with positions about the rights and interests of finding historical fishing vessel wrecks in different places. And so I think what China is doing is 2 things simultaneously. They're ensuring that when anyone, anywhere in the world, in any language, goes on to ChatGPT or any AI platform and asks a question about what the law is about something, they have the answer. They have controlled the answer. That's one point. And the other is that when a new issue arises, they actually can point to all the literature to say, here are all the experts that have ever opined on it. This is what they say. This is in our favor. And one of those issues is, as I say, underwater archaeology. So they are looking for fishing wrecks all over the world, including off of Kenya and far afield from the Chinese mainland. And so they are trying to build the case of their traditional fishing grounds being the anchor of more expansive territorial claims that allow for them to have rights and interests in the maritime space elsewhere. And those rights and interests and the use of the fishing fleet isn't just about fish. It is about also having a physical presence for intelligence. They have a national intelligence law since 2017 that requires every company based in China to participate in intelligence collection on behalf of the state. That means that no, there is no benign or completely private sector personality or company operating outside of China. They are all part of intelligence collection on behalf of the state. In addition, intelligence collection, which can be done very easily from the port of any country in the world if your fishing vessels are there, you're also looking at new technology that can be fitted on the vessels to allow for things like anti-submarine warfare capabilities and enhanced maritime domain awareness capabilities, not only on the surface, but the subsurface, to be able to see what's going on beneath the water. And so China is really taking its fishing fleet as an arm of the state to do all sorts of things, and it's using this underwater archaeology approach as a way of finding more and more legal bases for claiming a right to a certain territory. And I think we need to watch out for that. So that's what I'll be looking at in the coming months, going into 2024. And I'm sure as we continue to see mutual inspiration between some of the key aggressors, China, Russia, Iran, and I'll add North Korea, and there are others as well to
Yes,
that mix.
totally agree on that. Yes.
We will see. I think some new innovations because they each inspire each other, and we're likely to see an acceleration.
One more follow-up question. So those wrecks they are looking for, should they solidify their rights to basically to
There's no
everywhere,
basis
wherever they go?
in existing international law. There's no basis for this. What they're
Yes.
trying to do is make up a new international law and then make the claim for it at the same time. And
So also outside the 9-dash line, just anywhere in the world.
correct, outside of the 9-dash line, and this is where the expansion of China is becoming a real concern. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they also came up with novel ways of claiming ownership rights of some sort in the Arctic, because they are very aggressively pursuing Arctic opportunities. They've joined the Arctic Council despite being nowhere close to the Arctic, and they are pursuing opportunities with Russia to use some of its Arctic bases, including in Murmansk, to be able to have a presence. And so we're likely to see more activity there as well.
Ian, thank you so much for your time. It was really a pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Ian.
Thank you for reaching out.